the one country in which I've spent the most amount of time outside of Singapore is the United States of America. I mean, 10.5 years in New York, 2.5 years in Washington, D.C., 1 year in Harvard, and many other visits, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I've grown to like and respect the United States of America a great deal. And I should also add a very important personal note. I also got married twice in the US. So I guess my heart was pulled to the United States. And incidentally, I was introduced to my wife and by an American diplomat too. So I developed deep friendships in the United States. So there's no question that if you are a young, aspiring individual who has, a lot of beans, or like Satya Nadella, you're like Sundar Pichai, you can arrive as a young immigrant and do very, very well in the United States of America. There's no question. But at the same time, in terms of its foreign policy, unfortunately, the United States has been making more and more mistakes. And it's a good question to ask why that is the case. But one of the theories I'm developing is that in the Cold War, in one way or another, the Soviet Union acted as a major restraint on the United States, and the United States felt that it was in a real competition to win hearts and minds around the world. And American diplomats actually were in the Cold War very friendly, oozing with charm, and always trying to persuade you that the United States was on the right side of history, the Soviet Union was on the wrong side. And in a sense, you had American diplomats, American leaders making an effort to cultivate the world and get to know it. I can tell you, like someone like George Shultz, the Secretary of State, would spend 3 weeks traveling all around the Asia Pacific region, and someone asking, why are you spending 3 weeks here? He says, I'm taking care of the garden. You got to spend time. You got to meet people. You got to hear them out. You got to understand what they think, and so on and so forth. So that was the nature of American diplomacy during the Cold War. But unfortunately, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union ended, I have absolutely no doubt that what brought America down was that America got drowned in hubris. And we all know the famous end of history essay. And the most damaging part of the end of history of essay was that it actually made those in the United States and the West feel, hey, we won. So from now on, the rest of the world has got to converge towards us and become like us, liberal democratic societies. And so they have to do all the adjustment adaptations. We have arrived, we don't have to change and adapt. And I spent a year in Harvard in 91, 92, immediately after the end of the Cold War. And I can tell you the sheer arrogance, complacency of everyone in the United States then was actually quite shocking. And I remember in a discussion with the very famous, a very good man, I must say, a very good man, Stanley Hoffman, one of the best professors in Harvard. And after a discussion on the state of the world, I said, by the way, I don't think the future belongs to the West. I think, Asia is returning, and the 21st century will be the Asian century. And he went almost apoplectic, in his response. He couldn't believe that anyone would say that the West was not going to command history forever. But the fact that even a great intellectual citadel like Harvard could be consumed by such arrogance showed that, the end of the Cold War did a lot of damage to the American mind, to the Western mind. Because what it did was that it put the Western mind to sleep at precisely the time when Asia, especially China and India, were waking up. And I'm shocked that very few Americans know that from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India, always. And so the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end. And at precisely the moment when the aberration was going to begin to come to an end, as China and India were waking up, United States and the rest of the world went to sleep. And as a consequence of that, I think many Americans, forgot the discipline, forgot the lessons of the Cold War, and stop trying to understand the rest of the world. And so one of the things I try to do as a friend of the United States with my books is to say, hey, why don't you step back and see what the rest of the world thinks? Because most of the world, I can tell you, is not anti-American. Definitely not. But at the same time, they also want to be able to make their own decisions and not be forced to take positions because you come along and say, hey, your government is not good enough. We have to change and adapt your government. I mean, that's arrogant to tell societies with long histories that you know better than them how they should be governed. And that those sorts of sloppy intellectual habits. Plus, I think the one other consequence of the end of the Cold War is that you no longer had big picture strategic thinkers, like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, even who sort of realized that what you got to do is look at the whole picture and not just look at sections of it. But you lost these big picture thinkers in the United States, and I think that's part of the reason why the United States geopolitically seems to be relatively speakingly lost in the world. As I explained in my memoirs, when Dr. Goh Keng Swee was then a defense minister, offered me a job in the Ministry of Defense. He said, I'll make you join my team of whiz kids, and you'll get promoted very fast. You do very well. It was very enticing, but I said to him very sheepishly, Dr. Goh, I'm sorry, I can't join the Ministry of Defense because I'm a pacifist. Now he looked at me with total contempt and threw me out of his office. But I ended up in the foreign ministry, and I'm glad I ended up there because in a sense, I took to diplomacy quite well. But over the course of years of working in international affairs and geopolitics, I began to realize, especially after my 2 years in the Security Council in the years 2001, 2002, that when you get a clash between power and principle, power always trumps principle. It's all these considerations of power will determine the final outcome, which is why it's very, very important to be geopolitically realistic. And so when I look at the world today, for example, to take a practical example, I'm actually astonished by the geopolitical incompetence of the European Union. And I say this because the European Union, and the Europeans are smart, sophisticated people. They cannot claim they don't know history. Should have realized that they have to learn to live with Russia for the next 100 years. Now, of course, many of them, because they got seduced by the end of history argument, believe that they would never have to adapt to Russia. But Russia will, of course, eventually have to change, drop off all its communist, autocratic clothing, and become a clone of Western Europe, and then the problem will be solved. See, that's a completely wrong ahistorical view. And they fail to understand that other societies are going to make their choices and have their own concerns. So when the Russians consistently protested against the expansion of NATO, and they were sending very, very clear signals that if you keep on expanding, I have to react, I have to react. All these warning signals were ignored by the Europeans. And I can tell you, before Henry Kissinger died, a year before he died, I had a one-on-one conversation with him in his office, and he was sort of hinting that the Europeans have, in a sense, forgotten the art of doing realistic, long-term geopolitical thinking and trying to find out and figure out solutions, win-win solutions for everybody whenever you have a problem. And so, in the eyes of the rest of the world, even though they don't approve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal, let's be clear about that. The UN Charter is very clear about that, and we cannot approve of it. Yet, when the West imposed sanctions on Russia, 85% of the world's population didn't impose sanctions on Russia. And if I was someone in the West, I would say, excuse me, our goal was to isolate Russia. Do we end up isolating Russia or isolating ourselves vis-a-vis the rest of the world? And the Europeans were also massively hypocritical when they criticized the global south for keeping up their ties with Russia, because they themselves were secretly shipping gas, even through Ukraine, into Europe, all for the first 3 years of the war. I mean, they were lying to the rest of the world. And plus, the Europeans were also knowingly buying Russian oil, which had been refined in India. They knew it was Russian oil. So, I mean, all this hypocrisy is so evident. And therefore, it's time for the Europeans, I believe, and I say this as a friend of Europe, I want Europe to do well. It's time for Europe to wake up and realize that it can enhance its options best by being geopolitically realistic and carve out a position of strategic autonomy for Europe, where Europe can certainly cooperate very, very closely with the United States, but Europe should retain the option to cooperate closely with any other power it wants to, whether it's Russia, China, or India, or anyone else. But because at the end of the day, the thing that's really crazy about this is that the long-term threat to Europe doesn't come from Russia or Russian tanks. It comes from the demographic explosion in Africa that is happening. And in the long, in the year 1950, Europe's population was double that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is 2.5 times the size of Europe. By 2100, it'll be 10 times the size of Europe. So, clearly what you should do is focus your strategic sights on what's really important. And the reason I can confidently say that Russia will never be a threat to Europe is because Russia's biggest worry is not Europe. Russia's biggest worry is that its longest border is with China. And remember this, during the Cold War, Soviet Union was up here, China was down here. And the Soviet Union was kicking China around, excuse me. And they almost came to war in 69. Now, today, the situation has changed. China is here. Russia is here. You think Russia wants to take a fight with Europe? I mean, if the Europeans had any kind of strategic common sense, they would say, hey, Russia's got bigger worries. Now, let me find a way of dealing with Russia in such a way that I don't alienate them and I can focus on what I'm doing. Because, you mentioned that the goal of the Quincy Institute is to prevent wars. And, I've also launched something called the Asian Peace Program to try and prevent wars in Asia. The thing that's sad is that if the Europeans had any kind of geopolitical realism, or if they had the quality of mind of Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, they could have easily prevented the Ukraine war. So it was sheer geopolitical incompetence that has led to this Ukraine war. Just before I get to the Asian Peace Program, I want to just quickly add, your point about even the United States. I mean, as you know, the Europeans today are terrified by the election of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump believes that his mission is to make MAGA, make America great again, and not MEGA, not make Europe great again. So he's quite openly blatant in about saying that, hey, I don't care about you Europeans. I want to take care of myself first. So the Europeans should have anticipated this. They should have you must, whenever you take on long-term geopolitical analysis, you cannot just have one scenario, the best case scenario, and say, I'm going to work out my long-term strategic plans on the basis of the best case scenario. No, you got to have a medium case scenario and a worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario will be America elects a relatively isolationist president who says, I'm not going to pay a penny for the Ukraine war. I mean, they could have thought of that. And they should have said, hey, do our plans make any sense against the worst case scenario at all? They never did that, see? Is a lack of the kind of thinking that Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Lee Kuan Yew, and Rajaratnam would have done if they were asked to do an analysis before the Ukraine war. Now, in the case of Asia, I can tell you that one of the greatest achievements of Asia that unfortunately most people in the world don't appreciate is that there have been no major interstate wars in Asia for 46 years. And what's remarkable is that there have been no major interstate wars in Asia for 46 years, despite the fact that the biggest geopolitical shifts in the world, they're not happening in Europe, they're not happening in Africa, they're not happening in Latin America, they're happening in East Asia. So despite the fact that we have a region of major geopolitical shifts, we've had peace for 46 years. And I can tell you there must be some deeper cultural and intellectual reasons why peace is prevailing in this region. And sometimes we got to know what is bringing this about. And I have no doubt, for example, just to cite one concrete example of an organization that I wish more Americans would know about, which is Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which, by the way, was created as a pro-American organization in the Cold War, and was his creation was denounced by both Moscow and Beijing. So started off as a pro-American organization, and yet the United States dumped ASEAN at the end of the Cold War and forgot about it. Hey, but in the meantime, while the United States was focused elsewhere, ASEAN was quietly building a sense of community, not just in Southeast Asia, but also among all its Asian neighbors who would come every year to attend ASEAN meetings at the foreign minister level, at the summit level. And quite often, when Asian leaders quarreled and they couldn't talk to each other bilaterally, how do you solve the problem? You attend an ASEAN meeting, and then you can talk to each other. And within ASEAN, Indonesia has injected some Javanese concepts of what in Javanese is called musyawara and mufakat, which means consultation and consensus. So one reason why you've had no wars in Southeast Asia, even though Southeast Asia is the most diverse region of planet Earth, out of the 670 million people in Southeast Asia, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, you have Hindus, and you have lots of communists too in Southeast Asia. So if there's any place where you should see a war, it should be Southeast Asia. But guess what? No major wars in 46 years. Now, this cannot just be a fluke. This cannot just be an accident. It has to be a result of human intervention. And I spent 33 years attending ASEAN meetings. And I know that the personal relationships that were developed as a result of these hundreds, in fact, every year there's 1,000 ASEAN meetings a year. This personal relationship, this personal networking is so important. And just to make a very critical point here, even when the countries disagreed with each other, for example, Philippines still claims a state in Malaysia, incidentally. Philippines and Malaysia have normal relations and continue to cooperate. Whereas, by contrast, the United States, in a very strange reversal of the basic principle of diplomacy, United States says, I won't establish diplomatic relations with you unless you are my friend. But hang on, diplomacy was invented not to enable you to talk to your friends. Diplomacy was invented to enable you to talk to your enemies, because only in enemy courts would they chop your heads off. And therefore, what do? You create diplomatic immunity. So when you establish diplomatic relations, it means I don't trust you. I don't trust you. So I want diplomatic immunity before I come and talk to you. So logically, diplomacy was invented to enable you to talk to enemies. And United States, once it defines an enemy, should establish diplomatic relations with it, whether it's Iran, North Korea, Cuba, whoever, Venezuela. But the United States says, no, you must be my friend first. No, I can't figure out how is it that such a sophisticated country like the United States of America doesn't understand the ABC of diplomacy. But we in Asia do. And in Asia, even if you hate each other, you still talk to each other. The 21st century will be very different from any of the previous centuries, recent ones, especially 19th, 20th century. As I said, the past 200 years, you had one dominant civilization, Western civilization. The 21st century will be characterized by what I call 3 M's: multi-civilizational, multipolar, and multilateral, meaning you've got to have lots of meetings for people to resolve all these things. Now, the reason why you will have this multi-civilizational, multipolar, multilateral world is that you got to learn to deal with societies who are not like you at all, right? Who are the opposite of you. And one reason why American diplomacy has run into a ditch and European diplomacy has run into a ditch is because as soon as they come across a society which is not like them, which is different from them, they immediately say, no, 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 something is wrong with you. I got to impose sanctions on you. You're not right. You're not like me. But in Asia, we say, no, 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 no. I know you're very different. And I'm very different from you. But then we must understand each other. I must understand what's important to you. And you must understand what's important to me. And then we figure out a solution whereby we can live with each other. Right? Now, that's something that's quite basic that most Western diplomats have stopped doing. Because whenever they have a problem, I'll give you a case. You have a problem country in Southeast Asia, it's Myanmar. It's going to take some time to resolve it. It's a wicked problem. But what does the West do? Whenever there's a problem, you impose sanctions. What do sanctions achieve? Nothing. Have sanctions ever changed any country? Never. So why don't you just continue talking to people? At the end of the day, trying to find a compromise solutions. And that, I think, is something that the Asians have developed that I think the West should come and learn from. Look, I'll give you a simple example. You have this Kosovo problem that you fought the war over, right? So you separated Kosovo from Serbia, NATO did, and then you have this independent territory which still can't get into the UN and has no status and so on and so forth. Indonesia had the same problem. It had a region called East Timor, which separated, right? So in theory, Indonesia and East Timor should now be at loggerheads, like Kosovo and Serbia. You know what? Indonesia and Timor-Leste love each other. I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, sure.
The chief sponsor of Timor-Leste's admission into ASEAN is Indonesia. So, we are clearly doing some things right in Asia as a result of being very careful, pragmatic, and doing the best to treat each other with the utmost respect and never give condescending lectures or insult leaders. One of the worst things that the Anglo-Saxon media does is to constantly insult leaders. Xi Jinping, Putin, whoever, excuse me, who gave you the right to insult these leaders? Who? Who do you think you are? So this is a result of 200 years of cultural condescension from the 19th and 20th century, flowing into the 21st century, where it's going to hit a big hard wall and lead to many cracked heads in places like Europe.